Today we're going to talk about more ways to collect data and specifically talk about experiments and observational studies. So first let's talk about observational studies. So take a second and read this. So we want to do some research on why these cats and dogs are having kidney failure. And so what the researchers did was they did an observational study to investigate what was going on. And so in an observational study, we're having no control over what's happening. We're just sort of quite literally observing. And that might be by asking questions or looking at data. But we're not controlling anything that's happening within the scenario. So we're not going to do anything to make the dogs and cats get kidney failure. So what they did was they found pet owners whose pets were sick, and they asked them questions, things about their diet, any exposure to potential toxins, or anything else that may have caused this kidney failure. And so in that type of study, we would call that retrospective because they were going to people whose pets were already sick. So they knew they were sick already, and they were trying to basically research the history of that pet and their health. Uh, a different type of observational study would be a prospective study. And so in a retrospective study, you select the subjects and you look at past records, or you ask questions about their past, in this case, the health of the animals. In a prospective study, you select your participants and then you sort of like follow them over a period of time. So they might have selected some pet owners and then collected data on their health over a period of time to see if they had kidney failure in the future. But that might be hard to do because they might select dogs and cats that just are not going to get kidney failure. It's better in this case to have looked at the pets that already had it. So if we do want to have some type of control, uh, or we do want to be able to manipulate some of the factors, we would do an experiment. And so we're going to talk first about the 4 principles of experimental design. And I'll say up front, we've sort of talked about this before when we talked about correlation. An experiment is the only way to prove a cause and effect relationship. So the first principle is that we need to have control, and this is kind of a key in experimenting. It's what makes it from being an observational study, and it's we control things that might affect our results. So we're controlling to control for variation. We want to make sure that if we have different groups of people, that their conditions are kept as similar as possible so that we can see if the factor that we're interested in is having an effect on those groups. We want to be able to randomize, just like when we do a survey, we need to have randomization. In a survey, we randomly selected our participants. In an experiment, we randomly assign our subjects to a treatment. We'll talk about treatments in a minute. So we're not randomly selecting who participates, but we are randomly assigning them to different treatments. We need to be able to replicate our experiment. So that means we don't want to experiment just on 1 or 2 people. We want to have multiple subjects. Sometimes we might actually run the experiment multiple times, but we need to be able to repeat it. And lastly, if we need to, we should block. And we're going to talk about blocking towards the end of this lesson. It's another thing that helps us to account for variation, helps us keep condition among treatment groups as similar as possible. So take a second and read this scenario, and we're going to talk about how an experiment would work for these tomatoes. So this ad is claiming that this OptiGrow fertilizer will give you juicier and tastier tomatoes. And so somebody has decided, let's do an experiment to see if that's actually true. So I have below here sort of what a design of an experiment might look like. So first of all, uh, we have one factor that's sort of the variable we're trying to see that affects, in this case, the juiciness and tastiness of our tomatoes. And that factor here is the fertilizer. We want to see if the fertilizer has some sort of effect. And then our treatments are the levels of that factor. And so in this case, we're going to have three levels. We're going to have some tomatoes that we give no fertilizer to, some tomatoes we give half a dose of fertilizer, and some tomatoes that we give a full dose. So we have one variable and three levels, or one factor and three treatments. And so if we had 24 tomato plants, we would randomly assign 8 tomato plants to each of one of the treatments. So I'll randomly assign 8 plants to the control with no fertilizer, 8 plants to treatment 2, half dose of fertilizer, and 8 plants to treatment 3, a full dose. And the fact that we have 8 plants in each group shows that we have replication. We have random assignment because we'll randomly assign those plants to those 3 treatments. And then we have a control where we have sort of some sort of baseline to compare to. So we're gonna plant 8 tomato plants with none of the fertilizer to see how their juiciness and tastiness is. And then we have these 2 other levels where we give it a half dose and a full dose of the fertilizer. And after these plants have grown, we would do some test on their juiciness and tastiness. And that would be our response that we're looking at. So some things that help us in running a quality experiment is blinding, and we can use placebos to do that. So back to our pets, our cats and dogs who are having kidney failure, we want to see if this new brand of pet food is safe for them to eat. And so we'll give some pets the new food and some pets another food that we know is safe. We don't want to give them something that's unhealthy. And so the question here is, should the vet studying the pets or the dogs specifically be blinded? And that doesn't mean we don't want them to see. In any experiment, we have 2 groups of individuals. We have the people who could influence the results, so the people who are actually participating, the people who are giving a treatment, so like if it's about a medicine, the people who are actually administering medicine, people who are maybe if it's something about physical fitness, somebody who is uh, doing that sort of measuring something about your health, and then the people who look at the results. In this case, veterinarians or a physician. And so if one of these 2 groups, if everybody in one of these 2 groups doesn't know what treatment you're in, so in this case, the vet, if this was a single blind experiment, the vet wouldn't know which dogs were receiving which food. That's called a single blind experiment. So in this case, we would want the vet to be blinded. We wouldn't want him to know which type of food the dogs were going to get. So when he looked at when he was looking at the health of the dogs, he wouldn't be swayed to think the dogs with the new food were healthier just because that's what he wanted. If nobody knows who's in what group, that's called a double-blind experiment. And then sometimes in order to blind the subjects, we give what's called a placebo. It's a fake treatment. So if we were trying to test some sort of maybe new pain medication, we would have groups of people who took the pain medication, maybe a group of people who took an older pain medication, then we'd have a group of people who took a placebo, like a fake pill that looked like the medication, so that the people who are participating don't know which type of medication they're getting. They don't know if they're um, not getting the medication at all. Because sometimes if you think you're getting a medication, you'll feel better just because you think you should be. So placebos help uh, you in blinding in an experiment. Another thing we can do is we can block. So I would liken it a little bit to stratifying, where we can break things into groups because they have some sort of characteristic in common. And so uh, back to our tomatoes, what if some of our tomatoes come from one store and some of our tomatoes come from another store, and we think that uh, the tomatoes from one store might be affected in their juiciness and tastiness in a way that the tomatoes from the other one are not. So what we want to do is block them by store. So we would create two groups. So in this example, I have two stores, store A and store B. And then basically we would do the experiment with all the tomatoes from store A, and we do the experiment with all the tomatoes from store B. So in this example, we had 12 plants from store A and 12 from store B. And so we have our 3 treatments for block A of the 12 plants from store A. And then we have our 3 treatments for the 6 plants from store B. It's the same experiment essentially done twice for each set of tomato plants. And what this does is it eliminates the possibility that the store where you purchase your tomatoes from has some sort of effect on the juiciness and tastiness of your tomato. We could do something similar in observational studies where we match subjects who might have a similar characteristic to reduce some type of variation. So the last thing I want to talk about is confounding. Confounding is something that's often confused with a lurking variable. So we were talking about 2 quantitative variables when we made scatter plots and talked about linear regression, that sometimes you'd have a lurking variable that was connected to both variables that caused it to look like they had a relationship. Confounding variables, that happens when levels of one factor are associated with levels of another factor, and we'd say they're confounded. And so there's a really great example in the book about a professor who's trying to do a study on their uh, delivery method teaching. And so in the fall semester, he delivers using kind of a very monotone, boring delivery. And then in the spring semester, he does an upbeat, exciting delivery. He's teaching the same stuff, but his delivery is different. The problem there is that the season in which he's teaching may have an effect on a student's attitude towards the class. So at the end of the class, he takes a survey on how they feel about the class, and in the spring, the students have a higher average rating for the professor. And so you might think that that's because of his delivery, but it could also be because in the springtime it's sunnier, it's close to summer, the weather's nicer, and so no matter what, the season or the time of day is going to have some sort of effect on how students feel about the class, and so that is an example of confounding. So I know that was probably a lot of vocabulary, so I'm not going to attach any questions to this lesson. If you do have any questions, make sure you ask them in class, and we can have a chat about them.